The cowboy froze when she pulled a weathered letter from her coat and said, "There's something I should have told you 8 years ago." Rain hammered the tin roof so hard it drowned out the distant thunder. Naomi's fingers trembled around the folded paper, while water dripped from her sleeves onto the barn floor. Across from her, Tucker stood motionless, his jaw tight, his hat still dripping from the storm. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Then Naomi finally looked him in the eye and spoke the words she had buried for years, but what came next made neither of them move. "If this moment pulls you in, tell me where you're watching from." Late autumn came early to High Cedar Valley that year. The wind carried the smell of pine down from the hills, and thin ribbons of frost lingered in the shadows long after sunrise. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of weathered steel, and the dirt road running through town was busy with wagons trying to get home before dark. Naomi Brooks stood behind the counter of Brooks Farm Supply with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a ledger open in front of her. A ranch hand from the north pasture had just paid for 2 sacks of feed and a coil of fencing wire. Naomi counted his change twice, tore off the receipt, and handed it across the counter. The bell above the door rang before the man even stepped outside. Another customer entered, then another. That was how news traveled in High Cedar Valley. Not through newspapers, not through telegraphs, through boots and coffee cups and conversations that started as whispers. Clara Whitmore arrived just before sunset. She pushed through the door carrying the smell of fresh bread from her diner and stopped beside the counter. Naomi looked up. Clara studied her for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Tucker Hayes rode back into town this afternoon." The pencil slipped from Naomi's fingers, only for a second. It hit the ledger and rolled toward the edge of the counter. Neither woman moved. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Inside the store, the old clock on the wall kept ticking. Naomi picked up the pencil. "Did he? That's all you're going to say?" Naomi closed the ledger. "I don't have much else to say." Clara watched her. They had known each other long enough to recognize a lie when they heard one, but Clara said nothing more. After a few minutes, she left. The bell rang again, the door closed, and the store grew quiet. Naomi stood alone behind the counter. 8 years. 8 years since Tucker had disappeared from High Cedar Valley. 8 years since she had watched the dust from his horse fade into the distance. 8 years since she convinced herself she no longer cared. The trouble was that some memories never left. They simply learned how to sit quietly. Near closing time, Samuel Brooks emerged from the back room carrying a steaming coffee mug. His gray hair was thinner than it used to be. His shoulders bent a little more each year. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Naomi forced a small smile. "Just tired." Samuel handed her the coffee. "You've been tired for 8 years." She looked away. He didn't press further. That was one thing she appreciated about her uncle. He knew when silence needed company more than questions. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. One by one, lamps flickered to life across town. Naomi locked the front door, counted the register, covered the display bins. Every task happened exactly as it did every evening. But tonight, nothing felt ordinary. When the work was done, she walked to the front window. The glass reflected the warm light behind her. Beyond it stretched Main Street, the blacksmith shop, the church, the livery, the diner, and there, near Clara Whitmore's place. A brown horse stood tied to the hitching rail, older now, broader through the chest, but familiar. Naomi knew that horse. She had known it 8 years ago. The sight struck harder than she expected. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the coffee in her hand to go cold, long enough for the street to empty, long enough to realize she had never truly forgotten anything. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window. Naomi set down her mug, grabbed her coat, and stepped into the night. The air carried the bite of approaching winter. Her boots echoed softly against the boardwalk. She passed dark storefronts and empty wagons. A few townspeople glanced her way. Most pretended not to. Everyone in High Cedar Valley knew exactly where she was going. Naomi kept walking. The lights from Clara's diner glowed ahead, warm yellow against the gathering dark. The horse was still there. She stopped beside it. The animal lifted its head. Recognition flickered in its eyes. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, familiar. Naomi turned. Tucker Hayes stood a few yards away. The years had changed him. The boy she remembered had vanished somewhere along the cattle trails between Montana and Texas. This man looked older, harder, his shoulders broader beneath a worn canvas coat. A few silver strands showed near his temples. His face carried the weather of long seasons outdoors, but his eyes were exactly the same. For a moment neither spoke. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Wind moved through the pine trees beyond town. A lantern swayed gently outside the diner. Naomi had imagined this moment 100 different ways over 8 years. In some versions she yelled. In others she walked away. In none of them did she simply stand there. Yet that was exactly what happened. Tucker looked at her. Not past her. Not around her. At her. Like a man seeing something he thought he had lost forever. Finally, he spoke. Naomi. Her name sounded strange in his voice, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She folded her arms. What are you doing back? The question came out steadier than she expected. Tucker lowered his gaze briefly, then looked at her again. I found something. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. Naomi waited. But he didn't continue. I found something, he repeated quietly, that should have reached you years ago. Her heartbeat stumbled. What does that mean? Tucker hesitated. For the first time she saw uncertainty in him. Not fear, not regret. Something heavier. Not tonight. Naomi stared at him. 8 years of silence. And that was all he had? A single sentence? Part of her wanted to leave. Part of her wanted to demand answers. Instead, she stood there looking at the man she had spent nearly a decade trying not to miss. Then Tucker said softly, Meet me tomorrow morning, by Cedar Creek. She should have refused. Every sensible thought in her head told her to refuse. But when she finally answered, her voice barely rose above the wind. What time? Something changed in his expression. Not relief, something quieter. After sunrise. Neither moved. Neither smiled. The distance between them remained exactly the same. Yet somehow everything had already changed. Naomi turned first. She walked back toward the store without looking behind her. But halfway down the street, she heard the diner door open. He was still there, watching her go. And for the first time in 8 years, sleep felt very far away. Because tomorrow morning, beside Cedar Creek, Tucker Hayes was finally going to tell her what should have reached her long ago. Naomi lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the store settling through the night. The wind brushed softly against the walls. A loose board somewhere near the back room creaked every few minutes. From the next room came Samuel's occasional cough and the quiet scrape of his rocking chair before silence returned again. She stared at the ceiling. 8 years seemed impossible to fit inside one night. Yet every memory found its way back. Tucker laughing beside the horse trough outside the old Miller ranch. Tucker carrying sacks of grain into the store without being asked. Tucker standing beneath the church awning one spring afternoon, while rain drummed across the valley. Back then she had thought there would be time. Time to say what she felt. Time to stop pretending friendship was enough. Then one day he was simply gone, and everything after that had become survival. When dawn finally arrived, pale and cold across the mountains, Naomi was already dressed. She tied her dark hair back neatly, buttoned her coat, and slipped out before most of the town had finished breakfast. Frost covered the grass along Cedar Creek. The water moved quietly between smooth stones, carrying bits of yellow leaves downstream. Tucker was already there. His horse stood tied beneath a cottonwood tree. He held something in his hands. A folded piece of paper. Worn. Weathered. Handled so often the edges had softened. Naomi stopped a few feet away. Neither rushed to speak. The creek filled the silence between them. Finally, Tucker held out the paper. "I think this belongs to you." Naomi looked down at it, then back at him. "What is it?" "You should read it first." The paper felt strangely heavy. She unfolded it carefully. At first, she only recognized the handwriting. Then her stomach tightened. Vernon Reed. Every line after that seemed to slow the world around her. The letter had been written 8 years earlier. The date sat plainly at the top. The words beneath it were worse. Far worse. Vernon admitted he had lied. He had told Tucker that Naomi intended to marry a rancher from Billings. He had told Tucker she wanted a stable future and no longer wished to wait for a cowboy who spent most of his life on cattle drives. Naomi's eyes moved lower. The next lines hit even harder. Vernon had also confessed something else. He had told Naomi that Tucker left because he was tired of the gossip, that he wanted a fresh start somewhere nobody knew him, that he never intended to come back. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. Not from the cold. The creek continued flowing. Birds moved through the trees overhead. The world kept going as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. She looked up slowly. "You believed him?" Tucker nodded once. The answer came without excuse. "Yes." Naomi stared at him. Part of her wanted to be angry. Part of her already was. But the look on his face stopped her. There was no defense there. No attempt to justify what happened. Only the quiet weight of a mistake carried for far too long. "Why?" she asked. Tucker looked toward the water. When a man spends enough years on the road, he starts believing he's easy to leave behind. The words settled heavily between them. Naomi looked back down at the letter. She remembered Vernon stopping by the store all those years ago. Remembered the careful sympathy in his voice, the way he avoided her eyes while telling her Tucker had chosen another life. At the time she had believed him. Why wouldn't she? Tucker had disappeared the very next morning. No letter, no explanation, no goodbye. The paper suddenly felt impossible to hold. She folded it carefully, then unfolded it again. As if the words might somehow change. They didn't. Tucker spoke quietly. "I found it 3 weeks ago." Naomi looked at him. "Where?" "I bought an abandoned storage shed near Helena. Previous owner passed away last winter. The place was full of old account books and crates." He paused. The letter was hidden inside a ledger. Naomi swallowed. "And you came back because of this?" Tucker gave a faint nod. "I came back because you deserved the truth." The creek carried a branch past them. Neither moved. After a while, Naomi asked the question she hadn't planned to ask. "Did you marry?" Tucker's eyes lifted to hers. "No." The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No explanation. Just the truth. Something tightened inside her chest. 8 years. An entire lifetime in a place like High Cedar Valley. Most people married, started families, built new lives. Yet somehow Tucker stood here alone, the same way she did. A cold breeze moved through the cottonwoods. Naomi lowered her eyes. She wasn't ready to think about what that meant. Not yet. The hurt was still too fresh. The letter had answered questions she carried for years. But answers didn't erase lost time. They didn't erase lonely winters, or empty Sundays, or all the words neither of them had spoken. Tucker seemed to understand that. He didn't step closer, didn't ask forgiveness, didn't reach for her hand. He simply stood there beside the creek, waiting, respecting the silence. Naomi folded the letter one final time and slipped it into her coat pocket. She looked toward the valley. The morning sun was beginning to reach the ranches beyond town. Smoke rose from chimneys. Wagons moved along distant roads. Life was beginning another ordinary day. But hers no longer felt ordinary. Not after this. Not after learning that everything she believed about the last 8 years had been built on a lie. Finally, she turned back toward town. Tucker watched her carefully. Naomi. She stopped. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed. For a moment she couldn't answer, because she had wondered the same thing nearly every day. Without another word, she continued walking toward High Cedar Valley. The letter rested heavily in her pocket. And behind her, beside Cedar Creek, Tucker Hayes remained standing beneath the cottonwood trees. For the first time since his return, Naomi no longer feared what she had lost. Now she feared what might still be possible. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. High Cedar Valley kept moving the way it always had. Ranchers loaded feed before sunrise. Wagons rattled across Main Street. Smoke rose from chimneys each morning and disappeared into the cold Montana sky. But beneath the ordinary routine, something had shifted. Tucker Hayes stayed. That surprised people more than his return. The first week, he appeared at Brooks Farm Supply just after breakfast. Not to talk, not to explain, not even to ask Naomi for another chance. He simply carried 3 broken fence posts from Samuel's wagon and replaced them before lunch. When the work was done, he tipped his hat to Samuel and left. The next morning he returned. A section of the corral gate behind the store had begun sagging. Tucker spent 2 hours repairing it. Again, he left without asking for anything. Samuel noticed. Everyone noticed. By the 3rd week, rumors traveled through the valley faster than autumn wind. Tucker Hayes came back for Naomi Brooks. At Clara Whitmore's diner, people discussed it over coffee and biscuits. At church, conversations stopped whenever Naomi walked by. She pretended not to hear. Most days she succeeded. Some days she didn't. One cold afternoon, Samuel struggled lifting a crate of lamp oil from a supply wagon. Before Naomi could reach him, Tucker stepped in. The crate rose easily into his arms. Samuel chuckled. 8 years later, and you're still showing off. Tucker smiled slightly. Can't help it. Naomi was standing nearby checking invoices. She kept her eyes on the papers, but the corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. Tucker noticed. He said nothing. That evening, Samuel's cough grew worse. By midnight, his fever had climbed. The small clinic sat 2 miles beyond town near the North Road. The doctor couldn't come immediately. Snow had begun falling. The roads were turning slick. Naomi stood on the porch trying to saddle the old wagon horse when another lantern appeared through the darkness. Tucker. Without a word, he climbed down from his horse. I'll drive. Naomi opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. The trip to the clinic took nearly an hour. Snowflakes drifted through the lantern light. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts. Inside, Samuel slept beneath blankets while Tucker guided the team carefully through the storm. At one point, the wagon lurched hard, crossing a frozen ditch. Naomi instinctively grabbed the side rail. So did Tucker. Their hands landed inches apart. Neither pulled away immediately. Neither spoke. The silence carried more weight than conversation ever could. Samuel recovered. Winter deepened. And Tucker continued showing up. Always steady, always patient, never demanding. Naomi found herself looking for his horse outside the store each morning, then becoming irritated with herself when she noticed. One afternoon, she watched him repair a section of roof damaged by wind. His coat was dusted with snow. His sleeves rolled to his forearms despite the cold. The hammer rose and fell in steady rhythm. Not once did he glance toward the store window. Not once did he check whether she was watching. For some reason, that mattered, because it meant he wasn't performing. He was simply helping. By February, even Clara stopped pretending nothing was happening. "You know he's in love with you." Naomi nearly dropped a coffee cup. Clara smiled. "Still." Naomi looked away. Outside the diner window, Tucker was loading supplies into a ranch wagon. The sight made something tighten quietly inside her chest. Late one afternoon, a storm rolled down from the mountains. Dark clouds swallowed the valley. Rain followed, cold and relentless. Naomi had been delivering inventory records to a ranch north of town when the weather turned. By the time she started back, visibility had nearly vanished. Thunder echoed through the hills. Her horse became nervous. Then the downpour arrived. Sheets of rain hammered the valley. A voice called through the storm. "Naomi?" She turned. Tucker was riding toward her. Within minutes, they reached an abandoned hay barn near the northern grazing fields. The roof leaked in places, but it offered shelter. Rain drummed against the wooden walls. Wind rattled the doors. For a long time, neither spoke. They sat on overturned feed crates while water streamed from their coats. The storm isolated them from the world. No town, no customers, no rumors. Only rain. Tucker stared toward the doorway. "I thought about coming back 100 times. Naomi remained quiet. "I always found a reason not to." Another roll of thunder crossed the valley. Then Naomi asked softly, "Did you ever forget me?" Tucker turned toward her. The answer arrived immediately, no. The word settled between them. Simple, certain, real. Naomi looked down at her hands. The rain continued falling. 8 years of silence suddenly felt very small inside that barn. Her voice barely rose above the storm. "I loved you before you left." Everything became still. Even the rain seemed farther away. Tucker didn't move, didn't rush toward her, didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Naomi swallowed hard. "I never told you." The confession hung in the air between them. Years late, but finally spoken. For a moment, it felt like the beginning of something. The beginning of healing. The beginning of home. Then reality returned. Because when Naomi reached the store later that night, Samuel was waiting at the table. A stack of papers sat before him. Old account records, promissory notes, debt notices, and on the top page stood a familiar signature. Vernon Reed. Samuel removed his spectacles slowly. His face looked older than she had ever seen it. "We have a problem." Naomi's stomach tightened. "How bad?" Samuel slid the papers across the table. The amount owed stared back at her from the page, far larger than she expected, far larger than the store could pay. Outside, the storm continued moving across High Cedar Valley. Inside, the warmth from the stove suddenly felt very far away. Because just when Naomi and Tucker seemed ready to reclaim what had been stolen from them, something else had arrived. And this threat wasn't buried in the past. It was waiting at their door. The storm had moved east by morning. Thin fog drifted across High Cedar Valley, hanging low over the fields and fences like smoke that couldn't decide where to settle. Naomi sat at the kitchen table long after sunrise. The debt papers remained spread before her. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside them. Samuel was awake now, sitting quietly near the stove. Neither had spoken much since the night before. The numbers on those pages seemed impossible, yet they were there. Line after line. Interest, fees, renewals, signatures, all carrying Vernon Reed's name. Samuel rubbed his forehead. I should have looked closer years ago. Naomi folded one of the documents carefully. You trusted him. Samuel gave a tired laugh. That was the problem. Outside, wagon wheels rolled past the store. Business continued. The valley kept moving. But inside, Naomi felt as if something heavy had settled across her shoulders. For the next several days, she avoided Tucker. Not completely. That would have been impossible in a town this small. But she stopped lingering when he visited, stopped accepting coffee from Clara whenever Tucker happened to be sitting at a nearby table, stopped walking the long route home where they occasionally crossed paths. Tucker noticed. Of course he noticed. One afternoon he arrived carrying lumber for a shelf repair Samuel had requested. Naomi was organizing invoices behind the counter. The bell above the door rang. She looked up. Their eyes met. Only for a second. Then she returned to the paperwork. The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. Tucker placed the lumber near the back wall. Samuel cleared his throat, then conveniently disappeared into the storeroom, leaving them alone. Still, Naomi kept writing. Finally, Tucker spoke. Did I do something wrong? The question was simple, honest. Naomi tightened her grip on the pencil. No. You've barely looked at me all week. She stared at the ledger. A drop of ink spread across the page. Tiny, dark, permanent, just like every other problem in her life seemed to become. Tucker. She stopped. Because she didn't know how to explain this. How could she tell him she finally found the courage to admit she loved him only to discover the store might be taken away? How could she ask him to carry another burden? When she looked up again, he was still standing there waiting. Not demanding, not angry, just waiting. That somehow made it harder. I need to handle something, she said quietly. His expression changed. Not much. Just enough. The kind of disappointment a person tries to hide because they respect your right to leave. Tucker nodded once, then picked up his hat. I'll be around if you need me. The door closed behind him. Naomi watched through the window as he crossed the street. The distance between them felt strangely familiar, and she hated that. 3 days later, Vernon Reed arrived. He came during the afternoon rush. His black wagon stopped outside the store. Customers stepped aside as he entered. Vernon always carried himself like a man who owned more than property. Like he owned space, conversations, outcomes. He removed his gloves carefully, then placed another document on the counter. You've had time to review the debt. Naomi glanced down. Transfer papers, property rights, store ownership. Everything laid out neatly. Vernon smiled. Not warmly, just confidently. Sign these and the debt disappears. The room seemed smaller. Samuel stepped forward immediately. No. Vernon barely looked at him. I'm offering a solution. You created the problem. For a brief moment, something flickered in Vernon's eyes, then vanished. He straightened his coat. You have until the end of the month." And with that, he left. The bell rang behind him. The store remained silent long after. That evening, Naomi sat alone in the office reviewing old account books. One ledger became 2, then 3. Something felt wrong. Not emotionally, mathematically. Certain numbers didn't match. Dates repeated. Payments appeared twice. Some signatures looked inconsistent. She frowned, then pulled another ledger from the shelf. Hours passed. Darkness filled the windows. When the front door opened, she nearly jumped. Tucker stood there, holding a lantern. "I figured you'd still be working." Naomi exhaled slowly. He noticed the ledgers immediately. "What are those?" She hesitated, then pushed one across the desk. Tucker read quietly. A few pages later, his brow tightened. "This doesn't make sense." "That's what I thought." For the next hour, they sat together, comparing entries, checking dates, following numbers, piece by piece. The puzzle began revealing itself. The next morning, Tucker rode straight to Sheriff Eli Morgan. By afternoon, the sheriff was sitting in Naomi's office studying the same books. The lawman removed his spectacles, looked at the pages, then looked at Naomi. "Where did you find these?" "Storage records." Eli turned another page. His expression hardened. "There are alterations. More records appeared. From ranches, supply invoices, freight receipts, old debt notices." The deeper they dug, the worse it became. By the 4th day, Eli returned with 2 additional ledgers recovered from another ranch. The fraud spread far beyond Brooks Farm Supply. Several ranchers had been charged debts that never existed. Others had made payments that somehow vanished. The room grew very quiet. Naomi sat staring at the evidence. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. 8 years ago. The same year Tucker left. The same year Vernon told both of them lies. Slowly, she looked toward Sheriff Morgan. Why would he do all this? Eli leaned back in his chair. Before he could answer, Tucker spoke first, because he had already figured it out. His voice was calm, almost too calm, because Naomi would have found it. The words settled heavily into the room. Nobody interrupted. Tucker looked at the ledgers, then at Naomi. "You've always been better with numbers than anyone in this valley." Realization washed across her face. 8 years ago, she had planned to leave. Not immediately, but eventually. With Tucker. Everybody knew it, including Vernon. If she left High Cedar Valley, nobody would be left checking these books. Nobody would notice the changes. Nobody would connect the missing money. Sheriff Morgan closed the ledger. The sound echoed sharply. For a long moment, nobody spoke, because suddenly the truth stood clear before them. Vernon Reed hadn't destroyed their future because he disliked Tucker. He hadn't lied because of jealousy. He had done it because Naomi was dangerous to him. Not with a gun, not with threats, with a ledger, a pencil, and the ability to notice what other people missed. 8 years of heartbreak, 8 years apart. All because someone had been protecting a much larger lie. Outside, the church bell rang across High Cedar Valley. The sound drifted through the window and disappeared into the cold afternoon air. Inside the office, Sheriff Morgan slowly closed the final ledger. Then he looked at Naomi and Tucker. "We're going to need the whole town to hear this." And for the first time since Tucker returned, the fight was no longer only about the past. Now, it was about the truth. Word traveled fast across High Cedar Valley. By the end of the week, ranchers from both sides of Cedar Creek had heard there would be a community meeting after Sunday service. Nobody said much out loud, but everyone knew something serious was coming. The church sat on a small rise overlooking town, a white wooden building with weathered steps and windows that rattled whenever the wind came down from the mountains. On Sunday morning, every bench was filled. Ranch owners, farmhands, storekeepers, families. People who normally arrived late showed up early. Naomi sat beside Samuel near the front. Her best blue dress was neatly pressed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Only the slight tightening of her fingers betrayed what she was carrying inside. Across the aisle sat Tucker. He wasn't beside her. He didn't need to be. When she glanced over, she found him already looking her way. He gave the smallest nod. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. The kind of gesture that says, "I'm here." The meeting began after the final hymn. Sheriff Eli Morgan stepped forward with several ledgers under one arm. A low murmur moved through the room. Then Vernon Reed stood. He had arrived dressed as carefully as ever. Dark coat, polished boots, silver watch chain. The appearance of a respectable businessman. He smiled toward the crowd. "Before we begin," he said, "I think folks ought to know they're about to hear accusations from people trying to escape debts they legally owe." The room stirred. Several heads turned toward Naomi. She felt every eye. For years, she would have lowered her gaze. Not today. Vernon continued. "Some people would rather blame others than take responsibility." The words hung in the air. Sheriff Morgan's jaw tightened. But before he could speak, Naomi slowly rose to her feet. The room fell silent. Even Vernon stopped talking. Naomi stepped into the aisle. The church windows glowed with soft spring sunlight. Dust floated through the beams of light. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the creak of old wood. Then Naomi spoke, calmly, clearly, without raising her voice. "I kept records in this valley for years." She held up one of the ledgers. "I know what honest books look like." Several ranchers nodded. They knew she did. Naomi opened the ledger. Page after page. Dates, amounts, signatures, entries altered, payments duplicated, debts created where none existed. The evidence spoke louder than any speech ever could. Sheriff Morgan stepped forward and confirmed every finding, one by one, methodically. No drama, no exaggeration, just facts. The room changed. You could feel it happen, like a weather front moving across the valley. Faces that had arrived uncertain slowly hardened. People began looking toward Vernon. Not Naomi, not Tucker. Vernon. For the first time, the confidence slipped from him. He tried to interrupt twice, then stopped, because every answer led back to the same thing. The records, the numbers, the truth. Finally, Sheriff Morgan closed the last ledger. The sound echoed through the church. "Vernon Reed," he said quietly, "you'll be coming with me." Nobody moved. Not immediately. The moment seemed too large, too long delayed. Vernon's shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to understand. The fight had left him. As he was escorted outside, nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. People simply watched. Sometimes justice arrives quietly. The church doors closed behind him. And just like that, the shadow that had stretched across so many years began to lift. Outside, spring sunlight covered High Cedar Valley. Snow still lingered on the distant peaks, but the lower fields had turned green again. Life moved forward. The weeks that followed felt different. Lighter somehow. Samuel's health improved with the coming warmth. Customers returned to the store. The debt vanished. The property remained theirs. And Tucker stayed. Day after day, week after week. Not because anyone asked him to, because he wanted to. He repaired shelves, delivered supplies, helped ranchers during branding season, shared coffee with Samuel on the porch every morning. Nothing rushed. Neither of them wanted that. Some things deserved patience, especially after waiting 8 years. By late spring, wildflowers covered the hills above Cedar Creek. Yellow, purple, white. The valley looked softer than it had in years. One afternoon, Tucker asked Naomi if she wanted to take a ride. No explanation, just a simple question. She said yes. They followed an old trail above town, the same trail ranchers used to check grazing land. The climb wasn't difficult, just long enough to let silence settle comfortably between them. At the top stood a ridge overlooking all of High Cedar Valley. The church, the store, the ranches, the winding silver ribbon of Cedar Creek. Everything spread beneath them, the place where both of them had lost so much and found their way back. They stood there for a while without speaking. Wind moved gently through the grass. Somewhere below, a hawk circled above the valley. Then Tucker looked at her. Not at the mountains, not at the view. At her. The same way he had outside Clara's diner months earlier. Only now there was no distance between them. No unanswered questions. No lies standing in the way. He smiled softly. The kind of smile that appeared slowly, earnestly, as if it belonged there. Do you think we could spend the rest of our lives taking the long road home together? Naomi looked out across the valley, at the church where the truth finally came into the light, at the store Samuel had fought to keep, at the roads where she had spent years believing she was alone. Then she looked back at Tucker, at the man who had come home, at the man who stayed. Without a word, she placed her hand in his. The mountains stood silent around them. The wind moved through the wildflowers, and somewhere deep inside High Cedar Valley, two lives that had once been pulled apart by a lie finally found their way back to the same road. Not because the lost years had been returned. They hadn't. Nothing could give those years back, but because after everything that had happened, after every misunderstanding, every silence, every wound, and every truth, they chose each other anyway. And in the end, that choice was worth more than all the years they had lost. It was home. When I think about Naomi and Tucker standing on that ridge above High Cedar Valley, I don't really think about the lie that separated them. I think about the road that brought them back to each other. Because if we're honest, most of us have carried something unfinished. A conversation we never had. A truth we never spoke. A person we never fully stopped wondering about. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Put yourself in Naomi's place for a moment. Imagine spending years believing someone walked away from you by choice, only to discover that the story you built your life around was never the truth at all. Would you risk opening your heart again? Would you be brave enough to trust what remains after disappointment, distance, and time? What moves me most is that neither Naomi nor Tucker got those lost years back. Life doesn't usually work that way, but they were given something else, a second chance. And sometimes that's the greater gift. Not a perfect past, but the opportunity to build an honest future. Maybe healing isn't about erasing old pain. Maybe it's about finding the courage to keep walking, even when the road has been long. I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever been given a second chance that changed your life? And if stories about love, resilience, quiet courage, and the people who find their way home speak to something in your heart, I hope you'll stay a while. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting just ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.